On June 12, 1962, a prison guard reached into a cell on Alcatraz Island, touched what he thought was a sleeping man's shoulder, and felt only cloth stuffed under a blanket. On the pillow beside it sat a plaster head with real, human hair glued to the scalp, painted to match skin tone under the dim hallway light. 2 cells over, the same discovery. And in a third, the same thing again. 3 men, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, were gone. Not hiding in the yard, not caught trying to scale a fence. Gone, off an island surrounded by one of the coldest, most violent stretches of water on the West Coast, from a prison the United States government had built specifically to make escape impossible. For more than 6 decades, nobody could say for certain whether those 3 men drowned within sight of the city they were trying to reach, or whether they pulled off one of the greatest disappearing acts in American history. Now, researchers using modern current modeling software and forensic age progression tools have gone back through the case with tools that simply did not exist in 1962, and what they found doesn't hand us a tidy ending. It hands us something stranger, real evidence that the escape may have actually worked, sitting right alongside the total absence of any proof that it did. To understand why this case still matters, you have to understand exactly what Alcatraz was built to do. Sitting a mile and a quarter off the San Francisco shoreline, the island had started life as a military fort before becoming a federal penitentiary in 1934, the place the Bureau of Prisons sent inmates that no other institution could hold. Al Capone served time there. So did the infamous kidnapper, George Machine Gun Kelly. The entire design philosophy of the prison rested on one brutal fact of geography. Even if a man broke out of his cell, he still had to cross open water that the federal government considered a more effective barrier than any wall. In 29 years of operation, 36 men attempted 14 separate escapes. Every one of them ended the same way: recapture or a body. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers are the only names in Alcatraz history that don't fit that pattern, because no one ever found out how their story ended. Frank Morris was, by every account in his prison file, exceptionally intelligent, testing in the top fraction of a percentile among inmates nationwide. He'd spent much of his life inside institutions, and he'd already escaped from a Louisiana prison once before arriving at Alcatraz. John and Clarence Anglin were Georgia-born brothers, part of a family of 13 children, who had grown up swimming in cold rivers and lakes long before they ever robbed a bank. A 4th inmate, Alan West, was part of the planning from the start, occupying a cell near the others in cell block B. Over the course of roughly a year, the 4 men chipped away at the crumbling concrete around the ventilation grills at the back of their cells, using tools as unremarkable as spoons and a homemade drill built from a stolen vacuum motor, timing their work to the evening accordion hour so the sound of scraping concrete blended into the music. Behind those grills sat an unguarded utility corridor that ran up toward the roof, a hidden route through the building that the men slowly widened, night after night, hiding the damage behind painted cardboard panels. What they built once they reached that corridor is still, frankly, remarkable. Using more than 50 stolen and requisitioned raincoats, the men constructed a pontoon-style raft roughly 6 feet by 14 feet, gluing and heat-sealing the rubberized fabric using steam pipes running through the corridor as their only tool. They converted a small accordion-like instrument called a concertina into a makeshift bellows to inflate it. They built individual life vests from the same material, and they sculpted 3 lifelike dummy heads out of soap, toilet paper, and concrete dust, painting them with flesh tones from the prison's art supplies and finishing them with clippings of real hair gathered from the floor of the prison barbershop. Those heads fooled the guards through count after count, night after night, for weeks, until the morning of June 12th. On the night of June 11th, 1962, Morris and the Anglin brothers slipped through their enlarged vents, climbed the pipe network to the roof, pried open a ventilator, and descended the north side of the building, the side facing the water, away from the guard towers. West, the 4th conspirator, never made it out. His own vent hole proved too small, and by the time he finally broke through, the others were gone. He would later become the case's most important living witness, describing the plan in detail to investigators. though he could offer no proof of what happened once the other three reached the water. What we know for certain after that point is limited, and it's worth being honest about exactly how limited. The escape wasn't discovered until the 7:30 morning count, giving the men roughly an 8-hour head start before the largest manhunt the Bay Area had seen was launched. Boats, aircraft, and Coast Guard cutters combing the water and shoreline. Searchers recovered pieces of the raincoat raft, a paddle, and one deflated life vest floating in the bay. Days later, a sealed packet wrapped in rubber washed ashore containing personal photographs and a list of names and addresses belonging to relatives of the escapees. Precisely the kind of thing someone might carry if they intended to make contact with people once they reached shore, and precisely not the kind of thing that would still be dry and legible if the person carrying it had drowned wearing it. No bodies were ever recovered. Not one, in over 60 years, despite the bay's tides regularly returning the remains of other drowning victims to shore or shallow water within days or weeks. The FBI's official position, then and largely now, is that the men most likely drowned, their bodies pulled through the Golden Gate and out into the Pacific by the ebbing tide, never to be found. It's not an unreasonable conclusion. Water temperatures in the bay in June sit in the low 50s Fahrenheit, cold enough to induce hypothermia and impair muscle coordination within 20 to 30 minutes for someone without cold water training. The currents through that stretch of water are genuinely dangerous, capable of dragging swimmers far off course in a matter of minutes. 3 men in a hand-glued raincoat raft, however cleverly built, were up against conditions that have killed far better-equipped boaters. For decades, that was where the case rested, officially closed by the FBI in 1979, though the U.S. Marshals Service, which handles federal fugitive cases, has technically kept the file open because a fugitive case doesn't close until someone is confirmed dead or captured, and neither has ever happened here. This is where more recent research actually adds something new to the story, and it's worth separating carefully from the myth-making that has surrounded this case for 60 years. In 2014, a team at the Dutch Research Institute Alcatraz, working with a hydraulic engineering researcher, built a detailed computer simulation of San Francisco Bay's currents specifically calibrated to the tides and timing of that exact night in June 1962. Their model didn't declare the men survived, but it did show something the original investigators either missed or downplayed. If the men entered the water within a fairly narrow window, close to midnight, the ebbing tide could plausibly have carried a raft not straight out to the open Pacific, but on a curling path toward the Marin Headlands or Angel Island, giving them a real, if narrow, chance of reaching land rather than being swept out to sea. It's a significant finding because it directly challenges the assumption that carried the official case for decades, that the physics of the bay made survival essentially impossible regardless of skill or timing. The Alcatraz researchers were careful to state exactly what their model showed and didn't show. A favorable current existed within a specific window. It did not prove the men used it, found it, or lived through the crossing, even if they did. Separately, forensic artists and researchers, including work highlighted in documentaries produced with input from the U.S. Marshals Service, have used age progression modeling on the original 1960 booking photographs of Morris and the Anglin brothers, projecting how their faces might have changed across decades of aging. These reconstructions aren't photographs of real people spotted anywhere. They're statistical estimates of bone structure and soft tissue change over time, the same category of tool used to help identify long-missing children as adults. What makes them relevant to this case isn't that they proved anyone was found. Nobody using this technology has ever produced a verified match to a living or recently deceased person. What they did was give investigators and the public a genuinely useful reference for evaluating tips, sightings, and photographs that have surfaced over the decades, most of which have ultimately failed to hold up under scrutiny. And there have been a lot of those tips. The Anglin family has long maintained they received Christmas cards over the years signed in ways that suggested the brothers were still alive, and family members have described photographs, most famously one dated in 1975, allegedly showing 2 men resembling an aged John and Clarence Anglin in Brazil. that were eventually turned over to the U.S. Marshals Service for analysis. Marshals investigators who examined that photograph in the 2010s said it was intriguing enough to warrant a real look, but ultimately inconclusive. It has never been authenticated as depicting the England brothers, and no follow-up evidence has ever confirmed their presence in South America or anywhere else. Other reported sightings, deathbed confessions relayed secondhand, and claimed encounters at family funerals have surfaced periodically since the 1960s. None of them has produced verifiable physical evidence. No fingerprints, no confirmed DNA match, no documented identity anyone has been able to trace back to Morris or either England brother. So where does that actually leave the case? Once you strip away both the government's confident they drowned framing and the equally confident internet folklore that treats their survival as an established fact, it leaves you with something more honest and, in its own way, more interesting than either extreme. A genuinely unresolved case where the physical evidence is consistent with both outcomes and where the newest tools we have, current modeling and facial age progression, have narrowed the range of plausible scenarios without closing the file. The current research tells us survival wasn't the near impossibility the original 1962 investigators assumed. There was a real, if narrow, physical window for the raft to reach land rather than open ocean. It does not tell us the men found that window, used it correctly in complete darkness, or survived the following hours, days, or years afterward. The age progression work gives investigators a tool to evaluate future claims more rigorously. It does not, on its own, put a name to any living person. What's genuinely striking about this case, 6 decades on, is how much of what we don't know comes down to something very human rather than anything mysterious. If Morris and the England brothers did survive, they had every possible reason to stay hidden for the rest of their lives. Resurfacing would have meant returning to federal prison, likely for decades, for a crime that, notably, wasn't murder or anything especially violent. Their original convictions were for armed robbery. Family members who might have known something would have had every reason to protect that secret out of love, not conspiracy. And a federal government whose entire penal philosophy rested on Alcatraz being inescapable had little incentive to loudly investigate the possibility that 3 men had, in fact, escaped it. None of that is evidence of a cover-up. It's simply a recognition that silence, in a case like this, doesn't require anyone to be hiding something sinister. It only requires people with something personal to protect, and 60 years is a very long time for a secret like that to hold. The U.S. Marshals Service has been direct about where things officially stand. Unless conclusive evidence surfaces, a confirmed identification, a body, verified remains, the case legally remains open, and Morris and the England brothers are still listed as wanted fugitives on paper, even though, if they survived at all, they would now be well over 100 years old, and almost certainly deceased regardless of how the escape itself turned out. That's the strange practical reality of the case today. Even the most optimistic survival scenario has likely reached its natural end by now. What hasn't ended is the historical question of whether 3 men in a homemade rubber raft, in the freezing dark, actually beat the odds at a national manhunt, a federal prison system, and decades of official skepticism all assumed were unbeatable. Maybe that's the most honest way to leave this story. Not as a mystery solved by new technology, because it hasn't been, but as a mystery meaningfully re-examined by tools the original investigators never had access to, tools that replaced an assumption of near-certain death with an acknowledgement of genuine, narrow possibility. The evidence doesn't prove Frank Morris and the England brothers made it. It also doesn't prove they didn't. What it proves is that the case the FBI closed in 1979 was closed on an assumption about the Bay's currents that modern modeling shows was more confident than the physics actually supported. And that's a real, meaningful correction to the historical record, even without a body or a confirmed sighting to go with it. So here's where that leaves anyone looking at this case today. If you're inclined to believe the official version, the argument is straightforward. No verified sighting in over 60 years. No confirmed identification, no evidence beyond a family's hope, and an unauthenticated photograph, and cold, hard water that has killed far more experienced swimmers under far better conditions. If you're inclined to believe they made it, you're leaning on a real hydraulic study showing a genuine survivable path existed, a packet of dry, intact documents that doesn't fit a drowning, and the simple fact that in over 6 decades of searching, the bay has never given up a single body. Both positions are defensible. Neither is proven, and that, more than any dramatic reveal, is probably the truest thing anyone can say about the 3 men who rode off the edge of Alcatraz and, as far as the historical record is concerned, never came back. What do you think actually happened that night? Did the bay win, or did 3 men outsmart the most secure prison in American history? Let me know where you land in the comments, and if this kind of deep dive into real unsolved history is your thing, subscribe, because there are more cases worth taking a second, more careful look at.